Mexico's most ambitious infrastructure project in modern history is not just a railway. It is a geopolitical fault line running straight through America's backyard, and Washington has been dangerously quiet about what is happening there. Here is what this means for you. Every time American jobs move south, every time fentanyl crosses every time a Chinese-made product lands cheaper than anything built in Ohio or Texas, the infrastructure enabling that flow gets stronger. This railway is not a Mexican story. It is an American story, and nobody in mainstream media is connecting the dots. This channel runs on no corporate funding, no government backing, and no advertising pressure telling us what to. If this kind of analysis matters to you, the kind that follows the money, where mainstream outlets stop, hit subscribe, and turn on notifications right now. Because what we are about to break down goes several layers deeper than anything you have seen covered on cable news. Let us start with what is actually being built. Mexico's Tren Maya and the broader National Infrastructure Plan represent the largest ground transportation investment in Latin American history. President Claudia Sheinbaum's administration inherited a vision from her predecessor and has accelerated it. The Tren Maya alone stretches nearly 1,000 miles through southern Mexico, connecting Cancun to Palenque, slicing through the Yucatan Peninsula, passing within reach of the Guatemalan border. But that is just one line. The broader ambition is a rail network that eventually stitches together the entire country, Pacific ports to Gulf ports, northern industrial corridors to southern agricultural zones, and critically, Pacific coast terminals that face directly toward Asia. The construction contracts already awarded total over $20 billion. The projected total infrastructure investment through 2030 exceeds $45 billion. And here is where the story changes completely. Chinese state-linked firms are not just watching this project, they are positioning. KAOARC Corporation, the world's largest rolling stock manufacturer, has already supplied rail cars to Latin American networks. KAOARC is not a private company making business decisions. It is a Chinese state enterprise operating under the direct strategic guidance of Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative. When KAOARC enters a country's rail sector, it does not just sell trains. It embeds itself in maintenance contracts, spare parts dependencies, software systems, and long-term operational frameworks. The host country finds itself, 5 years later, unable to run its own railway without continued Chinese technical support. That is not an accident. It is the architecture. Here is the dimension almost nobody in Western press is discussing plainly. Mexico shares a 1,954-mile border with the United States. Every mile of new rail capacity built in Mexico is a mile of new logistical capability that connects Pacific-facing Chinese port relationships to North American supply chains. The railway does not need to cross the Rio Grande for it to matter to American national security. It just needs to move goods efficiently from Pacific ports Manzanillo, Lázaro Cárdenas inland, and northward. Chinese manufacturers already use those ports. A modern Chinese-built railway connecting those ports to the interior transforms Mexico's role in global trade in ways that directly compete with American reshoring ambitions. Let that land for a second. Washington spent the last 4 years trying to reshore semiconductor manufacturing. It passed the CHIPS Act. It subsidized factory construction. It spent political capital trying to pull supply chains away from Chinese dependency. And simultaneously, in the same hemisphere, a Chinese-linked rail build-out is quietly stitching together the logistics backbone that could make Mexican-based Chinese manufacturing permanently competitive with American-based production. The right hand and the left hand of American policy are not talking to each other. Now here is the technical layer that makes this more than just a trade concern. China's approach to rail infrastructure investment is not purely commercial. It is strategic doctrine. The Belt and Road Initiative, launched in 2013, has deployed over $1 trillion across 140 countries. The pattern is consistent. China finances infrastructure. Chinese firms build it. Chinese technical standards are embedded in the systems, and the host nation accrues debt denominated in ways that create long-term leverage relationships. Sri Lanka's Hambantota port is the most cited example. Debt obligations led to a 99-year lease of a strategically located port to Chinese control. Ecuador mortgaged future oil revenues. Zambia saw its national electricity grid become collateral. The infrastructure projects are real. The trains run. but the terms attached to them restructure sovereign decision-making in ways that persist for generations. Mexico is not Sri Lanka. It is the second largest economy in Latin America, a member of the USMCA trade agreement, and its government has historically been sensitive to sovereignty concerns. But the Sheinbaum administration is navigating serious fiscal pressure. Mexico's public debt is rising, infrastructure gaps are enormous, and Chinese firms offer something that Western development banks increasingly do not: speed, financing, and zero lectures about governance standards. The evidence indicates that Beijing has calculated precisely this dynamic. When a government is under fiscal stress, when infrastructure needs are visible, when domestic political pressure demands visible development progress, Chinese firms arrive with fully packaged proposals: financing, construction, technical systems, all bundled together. The competing offer from Washington is a mixture of USAID grants, World Bank processes, and private sector encouragement that moves at a fraction of the speed. In the race for infrastructure influence, slowness is a strategic loss. Here is what the mainstream coverage is consistently leaving out. The rail conversation cannot be separated from the port conversation. El Zorro Cardenas, Mexico's deepest Pacific port, has been quietly expanding its Chinese shipping traffic for over. It is already a primary entry point for Chinese steel, consumer goods, and industrial components entering North America under USMCA rules of origin frameworks that are, at minimum, being tested. The new rail corridors being designed in Mexico's infrastructure plan are not designed with American reshoring in mind. They are designed with Pacific to Atlantic, port-to-border efficiency in mind. That efficiency serves Chinese export interests as directly as it serves Mexican development interests. Now let us do the math. Because the math is brutal. China's QRR builds a standard gauge passenger and freight locomotive at a production cost approximately 30 to 40% below comparable Western manufacturers. European and American rail manufacturers, Siemens, Alstom, Wabtec, operate under union labor costs, environmental compliance frameworks, and Western capital costs that structurally prevent them from matching Chinese pricing. For a country spending $45 billion on rail infrastructure, a 30% cost differential represents $5 billion in apparent savings. No finance minister in the world ignores a $5 billion gap, and Beijing knows that. The interceptor problem for American policy is not missiles this time, it is procurement math. The United States cannot tell Mexico to pay $5 billion more for politically preferred rail suppliers without offering something concrete in return. And right now, Washington has not built the policy architecture to make that offer. $1 trillion deployed through Belt and Road, 140 countries participating, versus American infrastructure diplomacy that has struggled to close a single major competing deal in Latin America in the past 5 years. Read that ratio again. 1 versus 0 in the most strategically critical neighborhood on the planet. The rail gauge matters too. China frequently constructs rail using its own technical standard signaling systems, software protocols, coupling mechanisms that create long-term dependencies on Chinese maintenance and upgrade contracts. Once a country's rail network runs on Chinese software and Chinese signaling, the switching costs of moving to alternative suppliers become prohibitive. The infrastructure becomes a permanent point of leverage, not a gun to the head, something quieter and more durable, a relationship you cannot afford to exit. Now pull back from the immediate project and look at the chessboard. Beijing is watching the USMCA renegotiation timeline with extraordinary attention. The trade agreement comes up for review in 2026. China's strategic interest is to have Mexican manufacturing capacity, including logistics infrastructure, positioned to maximize Chinese value-added content flowing into North American markets, under whatever rules of origin framework emerges from that review. Every mile of efficient rail connecting Chinese linked Pacific ports to Mexican assembly zones strengthens Beijing's hand in that quiet negotiation. Not at the table where the deal is written, in the landscape through which the goods travel. Russia's interest here is different but complementary. Moscow gains from any development that deepens Mexico's economic relationships with non-American partners. Every degree of Mexican diversification away from pure American economic dependency creates friction in the hemispheric consensus that Washington depends on for sanctions enforcement, multilateral coordination, and diplomatic alignment. Russia does not need to build anything in Mexico. It simply benefits from China doing so. The Global South dimension is the one American policymakers consistently underestimate. Latin American governments, not just Mexico, but Brazil, Colombia, Argentina, Chile, are watching what Mexico negotiates with China on rail infrastructure. They are drawing conclusions about whether the Belt and Road model offers a viable alternative to Western development finance conditionality. If Mexico successfully absorbs Chinese rail investment, runs Chinese-built trains, and does not suffer the debt distress consequences that plagued some African and Asian Belt and Road participants, that becomes a proof of concept that accelerates Chinese infrastructure diplomacy across the entire hemisphere. The message transmitting quietly to finance ministries from Bogotá to Buenos Aires is this: you can take Chinese infrastructure money, build real things, and manage the turn. That message, if it solidifies, restructures the hemispheric landscape that the Monroe Doctrine was built to protect. Here is the closing reality. What is being constructed in Mexico's rail corridors is not just transportation infrastructure. It is the physical skeleton of a future supply chain architecture that China has spent 15 years building toward, and that the United States has spent 15 years failing to counter with anything more than warnings. The trains will run, the ports will expand, the contracts will be signed. And the question is not whether China gains logistical depth in the Western. The evidence indicates that process is already underway. The question is whether Washington builds a coherent counteroffer before the concrete cures. Here are my 3 predictions with a clock attached. First, within 18 months, at least one major rolling stock or signaling contract in Mexico's rail expansion will be awarded to a Chinese state-linked firm, triggering a formal diplomatic response from Washington that arrives too late to change the outcome. Second, the 2026 USMCA review will surface rules of origin disputes directly linked to Chinese manufacturing content moving through Mexican rail corridors, creating a negotiation crisis that neither side fully anticipated. Third, within 3 years, at least 2 additional Latin American nations will use the Mexican rail model as justification for their own Belt and Road infrastructure agreements, citing Mexican sovereign decision making as precedent against American objections. The clock is running on all 3. And the downstream consequences of getting this wrong extend far beyond trade deficits and supply chains. They reach into the long-term question of whether the Western Hemisphere remains an area of American strategic primacy, or whether it becomes, like so much of Asia and Africa before it, a contested space where Chinese infrastructure creates durable influence that no tariff and no sanction easily reverses. Drop your assessment in which happens first, the contract award, the USMCA crisis, or the regional domino effect. Tell me what you think, because I read every single one. If this gave you a framework that cable news didn't a way to connect rail contracts to supply chains to geopolitical architecture, share this with one person who needs to understand what is actually being built south of the border.